Hello guys, I hope you are doing good. Welcome to another video. Today we are going to solve a machine coding questions from Okta's interview, Okta SDE2. Before jumping to the problem, I just wanted to give you a heads up, like if you are preparing for your front-end interviews, do check out my course on alpha.learnersbucket.com. I have everything that you need to prepare for your interviews. You also get access to the company's wise question set, Zeta, Atlassian, Coursera, Zepto, Meta, ThoughtSpot, and many more. And I'm also constantly adding the questions. So if you're preparing for your interviews and if you're looking for a single platform with all the resources, so do check out my course. Once enrolled, you get lifetime access to it. So let's try to solve this problem. Let me close the sidebar. If you see, this question was posted on LeetCode on July 12, 2025, which means this was a recent interview question. And from this, we are going to solve this round 1 React machine coding question. This was for SDE2 level. So you can expect this for if you are around 3 to 4 years or within 6 years of experience. So if you read the problem statement, it says that we have to create dynamic grid with incremental values. So the problem statement says that we have to take a number as input via input box, and then we have to generate a grid of size n into n, and then the grid logic will be initially all cells are empty. On clicking on an empty cell, fill it with the max existing numbers, which is the cell number plus 1, and if we click on the non-empty cell, then we have to fill with the max existing numbers. So here it is not clear what is the existing number, so I am going to use the cell count as the number and will update. So if we click on the empty cell, we'll update it with the existing number plus 1, and if it is a non-empty cell, then we'll update it with the existing number. And what was the expectation was well-structured and modular React components, optimal state management, efficient computation of the maximum values, clean UI and minimal re-rendering, and bonus for explanations and performance considerations. So considering or keeping this thing in mind, let's try to solve the problem. The second problem, so there was many more problems here, debouncing and throttling. This is already, the video on this is already present. You can check out my channel for this. Then difference between synchronous and asynchronous API calls and all those things. And round 2 was majorly on system design, content publish platform, or basically a CMS we had to create. So we'll look into this later. Let's try to solve this problem first. So coming back to the question, here I have the same problem statement ready, and this is a dummy output. So if you see, this is the input, this is a render button to keep it controlled. When I click on render button, then only the grid will be generated. If you change the input value, this grid will be hidden, and unless you click on the render button, it won't be generated. And now you see how does it functions. So I have generated the grid in zigzag shape or in a S shape. So I'll follow the same over here. So it goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, then coming back 5 will be just down to 4, and then it will be in reverse order. So zigzag like this. We'll be creating the same grid, and this is how the final output will look like. So let's try to create this. Let me also hide the instructions so that we get more area for code. Many people complained that the code area was not visible properly. Now that you are well versed with the problem statement, so we just have this area to us for coding, and then we have style and the main.js file. This is the browser console. We don't need this. Let's hide that. And from here, let me clear everything inside this and the state also. So all these three things. Here I'll create a div and a div again. Inside this we'll have an input. So input type, I'm going to keep this as number, a simple one. And then this will be a control component. So on change, we'll have on input change handler, and then the value of this will be a value. Sorry. a value. So we'll be maintaining the state. Let's say grid size, name it properly. These all things, small things matter in the interview. So your naming convention for the variables also matters. And after this, we'll have a button. So button will basically use to render the grid. So render, and on the click of this, we'll say handle grid render. And now I'm going to create two states. So const grid size and then set grid size, that will be used. The initial value will be 0. This will be to maintain the grid size, and then the second will be to render. So render grid, set render grid, and this will be used state and false by default. Now on the click of the handle grid renderer, on handle grid render, we are going to set this as true, and after this what we are going to do is inside, so let me create this fragment, and now outside this we are going to say if there is asked to render grid, then we are going to render span, or let's say a p tag rather than span, so that it is visible properly on the UI, and inside this the grid size. We'll replace this, for now we are just printing the grid size. We'll replace this with the actual grid component that will take the size as input and then generate the number of grids with the cells. So this will be done when we click on the render button. This sets the render grid as true, and then when the render grid is set as true, it will render this component. Now on the change of the number, so on input change handler, so const input change handler, we are going to take the event, and then the first thing what we are going to do is we are going to set the render grid as false. So when the value updates, we want to hide rendering of the grid and we want to only render on the click of the button. This is to avoid updating the component as we change the value. So keeping it controlled makes sense. And now after this, we are going to get the value from the target. So we got the events e.target, we are getting the value, and then we are going to set the grid size. So here the grid size will be value. Now because this is a number component, it can go into negative values. So we can add a check. If value is less than 0, then 0, otherwise value. This is the precautionary check, so that even if we are setting negative value, it should not go to negative. So see, it cannot go less than 0, but it will go to a positive number. So this is a precautionary check. We don't want a negative value because we cannot render a grid of that size. So we added a check. Now let's say if I change the value as 1, I click on render, 1 is there, but if I come and change it to 2, it is hidden. If I click on the render again, it will be render. So our logic to take the grid size as input and then on the click of a button to render it is working fine. Now let's move to the next part of the code. So above the function app, I'm going to create the grid. So here I'll say const grid, and then this will take the size as props, and this will generate the grid. And to generate the grid, I'm going to create a wrapper around this so that we can style it. Class name grid wrapper, and then inside this we are going to generate the cells. Now to generate the cells, I'm going to make use of another component so that the click event on the cell is controlled. Now you can also have your logic abstracted over here, but that will make your code less readable. So what you want to do is you want your code to be more readable, so you just separate the logics. So the cells, I'll separate it. So for now, just let me render a dummy text cells, and I'll cells with the size, I'll just render the size as well. And then now let's use this grid in place of this text. So we'll have the grid with the size equals to grid size. And if I save this and reload over here, you'll see render, and then I'm getting cells 3, which means our grid component is rendering. Now let's come to the logic of rendering the grid. So a grid of size n into n is basically a multidimensional array, and n into n array. So following the same logic, because we can render the arrays as it is in React, and also we can add the JSX as an array element, so we can use that to generate the grid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a helper function over here, const generate grid, and what this will do is this will return us an array. So let's create an array, const grid array. This will be a multidimensional n into n array, and is the size of the grid. And here I'm going to use a variable count equals to 1. This is to keep the count of cells, number of cells that we are generating. So in a grid size of 3, we will be generating 9 cells. So from 1 to 9, 3 into 3 becomes 9. So to keep the track of each cell, I'm going to use this variable. So that's why I've wrapped this inside this function with the variable count equals to 1. This helps us to generate the grid. And now here, let's do a simple array iteration. Let I equals to 0, I is less than size, I plus plus. And here in the grid array, so this becomes the first or the outer layer. You can call it as a row, and then we are going to have the number of columns as well. So let me create another variable. Let me create another variable to contain all the row elements. So const row, you can also have it defined as let, because we are going to use the methods on this variable, not going to modify it directly, so there is no issue. And then I'm going to use for let j equals to 0, and then j less than size, j plus plus, and inner array. So this becomes the columns, and here I'll say row dot push, and inside this we are going to push the cell. So we are going to yet to create this component. We will be creating this cell, and to this cell we are going to pass the count. Count is basically the numbering of the cells, and once we have added this, we are going to increase the count by 1. And then finally, after this, in the grid array, we are going to push div slash div, and here we'll add the rows. And at the end of this generate grid, after the for loop, we are going to return the grid array. And now let's generate this or create this cell component on top of this. So const cell, this will take the count or the number, whatever you call this, as input. Let me call this count only. And here what we are going to do is we are going to return a div with the value count. This is so that we can see if the cells are generating properly or not. And then this generate grid function which we have created over here, we are going to call this in the place of text. So now you see we got our cells generated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If I change this to 4 and click on render, so we got our 16 cells generated. If I change this to 5 and click on render, we'll have 25 cells generated. So cells are generating based on the grid size n into n. So our logic is working fine, but the problem statement says that initially all cells are empty, and when we click on empty cell, it should fill up with the number plus 1, and if we click on non-empty cell, then it should fill with the number itself. So before implementing the logics, let's add the styling to this so that it looks like a grid. So let's do that. So what we are going to do is we are going to add a basic styling. We have this grid wrapper defined over here. We'll be using that as a selector. So dot grid wrapper that will display flex and then align items center, justify content center, and then have a gap of 10 pixels between each cell. Then the flex direction will be column, and we'll say that margin top is 20 pixels. So it will have some space between the input and the button and the grid itself. After this, we'll say grid wrapper. So this is the wrapper style. Then all the inner row style. This will display inline flex, and we'll have a gap of 10 pixels again, and then dot grid wrapper. Every odd or every even row will change the direction of the columns. So that's what I'm going to set, and child even, so that we can get the zigzag pattern. So in the grid wrapper, every even row will have the flex direction as row reverse. And then let's define the cell. So dot grid wrapper, this will become row and this will become cell, and we'll have a width of 50 pixels, height of 50 pixels, and then display flex, align item center, justify content as center, and border as 1 pixel solid. This will take black by default, and then cursor as pointer. And to display if the cell is clicked or not, we can have an active class, but that is for later case. So let's save this, let's reload, and now let's generate a grid of size 3 by 3. So you see that a grid is generated in the zigzag pattern. So it goes from 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So our grid is generated properly. Now coming back to the cell, let's have our logic. So initially all the cells will be empty. So for that, what we are going to do is we are going to use a state. So we are basically going to make use of two states, because we have to handle the empty case, and then after that initially it will be empty, but once it is clicked, then its value will keep on changing. So what we are going to do is we are going to maintain the state empty, set empty, and that will be use state true. So initially it will be empty, but after this we are going to update the value. So what we are going to do over here is we'll say if empty, then this will be empty string, otherwise the count, it will be generated. So now if I say all the cells are empty, but when I click this, then the value should be updated. So for that I'm going to use another state So const val and then set val and use state as count. So whatever value I'm getting as a prop, that will be the initial value. So this val is what we are going to render. And now when we click on an empty cell, we have to update its value. So initially the val is same as the count, but if it is empty and we are clicking it, then its value should be val plus 1, otherwise it will be val itself. So let's do that. On click, we are going to on click handler, and here we are going to create that const on click handler. And here what I'm going to do is I'll say set empty as false. So once we have clicked an empty cell, it is no longer empty, so we are updating the state set empty as false. Now coming to the value logic, according to the problem statement, when you click on empty cell, it fills with the number or the val plus 1. So here we have to add a check. So set val, if it is empty, then we are going to say count plus 1. We cannot rely on val because val value will be changing. So we'll say that count is the source of truth, it won't change. So if it is empty, then it goes count plus 1, otherwise it will be count only. So this is the logic, and now let's test this. So I got 3. So if I click on this, the starting value is 1, but if I click on the empty cell, it will be whatever the value is plus 1, so we should get 2. We got 2. But if I click on this again, because it is a non-empty value, then it should reset to its previous value or the original value, so it will be changing to 1. But after this, there is no change. So that's what the problem statement says. Initially all cells are empty. On clicking on an empty cell, fill it with existing number plus 1. On clicking on a non-empty cell, fill it with existing number. So it works properly. If I render it, if I click on this, this will go the existing number plus 1. If I click on empty cell, so it becomes 2 and then 1. Similarly 3 and 2, 4 and 3, 5 and 4, 6 and 5, and like that. So it keeps on changing. It works perfectly fine. So this is how you can create this. The most important part was generating the grid. Why? You can also handle the logic here also, but it becomes too complex. It becomes complex to handle the click events, because if you rely on the count over here, you have to manage it properly, because if the grid is generated, then if the iteration has been completed, and the count value will be the size square, which will be n into n, so it will reach to the end value, then you have to handle it properly on the click of the events. So it's better you separate the concern, you create a new component and handle the values inside that. This is what React is for, where we create components and we create the clear separation of concerns. So this is how you can do this. I hope you have learned something new today. Thank you for your time.